Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something a little more refined, a little more ridiculous, and a whole lot more high maintenance. The world of the Regency dandy. Not the powdered peacocking fops of your grandfather's day, with their sky-high wigs and their beauty spots. No, these were men who conquered the entirety of fashionable London, armed with nothing but a perfectly tied neckcloth, a devastating stare, and the ability to bankrupt themselves in the most tasteful way imaginable. Before we begin, I want to say a genuine thank you to Linda for suggesting tonight's topic. Your suggestions are the reason this whole thing keeps going, and I really do read every single one. If you enjoy what I do here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure whatsoever. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what unholy hour it is for you, because somehow it's always well past midnight somewhere. The channel is also on Spotify now, so if you'd rather drift off with just my voice and no glowing screen, the link is down in the description, and if you ever want something longer to sink into, there's an 8-hour ad-free version waiting for the members who quietly keep the lights on around here. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Let's wonder about a few things together. Have you ever wondered how long it takes to look like you didn't try at all? Could you survive a morning that involved 3 hours, 2 valets, and 11 ruined cravats before you'd even had breakfast? Would you spend your entire inheritance just to be admired by people you secretly can't stand? What would you do if your whole reputation rested on the whiteness of your shirt and the precise tilt of your hat? And could you insult a future king to his face in a crowded ballroom and somehow live to brag about it? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1815 in a rented set of rooms in Mayfair, with a pounding head, a mountain of unpaid bills, and a valley looming over you holding what he swears is the only acceptable shade of white. Welcome to the Ton. Try not to embarrass yourself. Let's begin where every dandy's day begins, not in a grand ancestral castle, but in a suspiciously expensive set of rented rooms somewhere in Mayfair, paid for with money you almost certainly do not have. You blink awake to filtered grey London light and the faint smell of coal smoke, candle wax, and the odour nothing that comes from a man who bathes on purpose. There's no crowing rooster, no clanging church bell dragging you from sleep. Just your valet, standing at a respectful distance, silently judging the state of your hair. Because here's the strange truth about being a dandy. You may be broke, untitled, and one bad card game away from ruin. But for the next several hours, this bedchamber is a temple, and you are both the priest and the sacrifice. Take a moment to look around, carefully, because the room itself is doing a great deal of quiet lying on your behalf. The furniture is elegant but sparse, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a tall mirror positioned to catch the best light, a wardrobe holding more coats than a sensible man could ever justify. Everything is arranged to suggest wealth, taste, and ease, and almost none of it is truly paid for. Your rooms are a stage set, and you're the leading man in a production that could be shut down at any moment by an unpaid landlord with a firm handshake and a firmer ledger. The location matters enormously. You're not simply living somewhere, you're living in the right somewhere. A fashionable address in the correct neighbourhood was half your identity, the way a certain postcode or a certain kind of apartment signals things about people today. Live in the wrong street, and no amount of perfect tailoring could save you. Live in the right one, even in 2 shabby rooms above a shop, and society would politely agree to pretend you belonged. Address was armour, and yours was doing heroic work covering for the emptiness of your purse. Notice, too, that you have woken alone, but you will not stay that way for long. The dandy's morning was a curiously public affair. Friends would call, your valet would hover, tradesmen might knock, hopefully not the ones you owe. In a modern sense, Imagine being unable to properly start your day until an audience assembles to watch you do it, like a live stream nobody agreed to but everybody expects. Privacy, that thing you take for granted, was in short supply, and frankly you never wanted much of it anyway. What is the point of being magnificent if no one is around to notice? Your head, meanwhile, is not cooperating. Last night involved cards, wine, and a great deal of very witty conversation you can only half remember. And the bill for all three is coming due in ways both financial and physical. But a dandy does not groan, does not clutch his temples, does not admit weakness. A dandy rises with the serene composure of a man who has never once made a poor decision in his life, which is a spectacular piece of acting given the evidence stacked on the writing desk in the form of unopened letters, all of them, suspiciously, from people to whom you owe money. And so the day begins, not with coffee and a stretch, but with a deep breath and a glance at the mirror. There is a great deal of work ahead. Becoming effortless, it turns out, is the hardest labour of all. It's time to get ready for the day, and I hope you cleared your calendar because this is going to take a while. Modern people talk about a morning routine like it's a 10-minute affair involving coffee and mild regret. For a Regency dandy, the morning toilette could stretch across the better part of the day, and gentlemen of fashion routinely surrendered several hours to it without blinking. This wasn't vanity in your eyes. It was a discipline, an art form, practically a spiritual practice. Every stage had to be performed in the correct order, with the correct tools, in front of the correct mirror, ideally with an audience of admiring friends who had dropped by to watch you become presentable. Yes, watch. Grown men would sit in your rooms and observe you dress, the way people today watch a chef plate a very small, very expensive meal. Think about the sheer arithmetic of it. If a man spends the whole of a morning, and sometimes well into the afternoon, simply preparing his appearance, that leaves a rather narrow window for anything resembling an actual life. And that was precisely the point. To devote hours to your toilette was to announce, loudly and without saying a word, that you didn't work, did not toil, did not sully your hands with anything so vulgar as employment. Time itself was the ultimate luxury good, and you spent it lavishly on your own reflection. The ritual moved in stages, each one a small ceremony. There was washing, there was shaving, there was the careful arrangement of hair, there was the sacred ordeal of the neckcloth, there was the dressing proper, layer by exacting layer. Skip a step, rush a step, or perform them in the wrong order, and the whole edifice wobbled. It was less like getting dressed and more like assembling a very delicate, very expensive machine that happened to be shaped like a man. Your friends, lounging about your rooms during all this, were not merely killing time. They were witnesses, and they were students. The toilette of a leading dandy was a masterclass, and lesser men studied it the way an apprentice studies a craftsman. How did he tie that? How did he get that shine? Why does his coat sit like that when mine bunches at the shoulder? To be granted admission to a great man's dressing room was an honour, a peek behind the curtain of the magic show, and you can be certain everything they saw would be dissected across the clubs by nightfall. Now, compare this to your own frantic mornings, hopping on one foot to pull on a sock while the kettle screams. The dandy would be horrified. Speed was the enemy. Efficiency was for tradesmen. The entire glory of the thing lay in its slowness, its refusal to hurry, its serene insistence that the world could simply wait until you were ready. And the world astonishingly did. By the time the toilette was complete, you had not merely dressed. You had composed yourself in the fullest sense, assembling a public self so polished and deliberate that the sweaty, hungover, indebted creature who first opened his eyes that morning had been entirely erased. In his place stood a monument to leisure and control, ready to stroll out and be admired. Of course, all of this careful, ceremonial labour was aimed at one final, maddening goal, looking as though you had put in no effort whatsoever. hours of work in service of appearing to have just thrown something on. It's the great paradox of the dandy, and we begin unravelling it right now with water. Now let's talk about something that will sound painfully obvious to you and was borderline scandalous to everyone else in 1815. You're going to wash your entire body with water on purpose, possibly every single day. In an era when much of society still regarded a good hard scrub as vaguely dangerous, and when perfume existed largely to smother the truth, the dandy did something revolutionary. He got clean. The great arbiter of taste himself preached that a gentleman should be washed thoroughly and smell of absolutely nothing. No cologne, no scent, just soap and country air and the quiet confidence of a man with functioning pores. To appreciate how strange this was, you have to understand what everyone else smelled like. This was a world where heavy perfumes were slathered on precisely because bathing was infrequent. A world where a nobleman might mask weeks of accumulated life under a fog of musk and rosewater. The fashionable nose had grown accustomed to a certain richness of air. Into this walked the dandy, radiating nothing but soap and skin, and the effect was as startling as walking into a crowded room and realizing you were the only person not wearing a costume. The practicalities were not glamorous. There was no gleaming bathroom with a tap you simply turned. Water had to be hauled, often heated over a fire, and poured into a tub by servants who very much did not share your enthusiasm for this new craze. Getting properly fully clean was labour, and it was labour performed by other people on your behalf, which of course only added to the prestige. Anyone could splash their face. It took a household and a philosophy to bathe the whole of a man every day. Once in the water, you scrubbed. Not gently. You scrubbed until your skin flushed pink, and every trace of the city in the previous evening was sloughed away. The goal was not merely to be clean, but to be conspicuously, aggressively clean. Clean in a way that others could notice and envy and fail to replicate. Your freshness became a kind of silent boast, a way of implying that everyone around you, for all their titles and jewels, was in fact just a little bit grubby. Here is the modern comparison that captures it best. Today, in a world where everyone showers, the flex is elaborate. The 10-step routine, the expensive serums, the endless products. But in your world, the flex was almost absurdly simple. You outclassed a duke by being demonstrably clean while he was demonstrably not. It was the 18th century equivalent of quietly drinking plain water at a party where everyone else is trying too hard and somehow winning. There was a discipline to it that bordered on the religious. Cleanliness was not an occasional treat, but a daily obligation, a standard you held yourself to with the seriousness of a monk keeping his vows. Miss a day and you had not merely been lazy, you had failed. The body was the foundation on which the entire glorious structure of dress was built, and no amount of exquisite tailoring could rescue a foundation that reeked. And so you emerge from the tub, pink, scrubbed, and smelling triumphantly of nothing at all, the cleanest man in London, and quietly delighted about it. It is one of history's gentle ironies that a movement remembered for its extravagance and its ruin began each day with something as humble and sensible as a good wash. But the war on grime was not over. Your face in particular had ideas, and it was time to deal with them. With the bathing conquered, we turn to the face, and here the standards only get more unhinged. The dandy's face had to be smooth. Not mostly smooth. Not smooth enough. Alarmingly, mirror-fogged, baby-cheeked smooth. So you take up your straight razor, a wickedly sharp blade with no guard, no safety mechanism, and no forgiveness whatsoever, and you drag it across your throat before breakfast while nursing last night's headache. What could possibly go wrong? Let's sit with the horror of the tool for a moment. Your razor is a single folding blade of honed steel, kept keen on a leather strop, sharp enough to open you up like an envelope should your hand slip or your nerves fail. There is no cartridge, no lubricating strip, no comforting little aloe cushion. There is you, a blade, a basin of water, and the trembling remains of your composure. Men were quite regularly nicked, sliced, and left dabbing at their own throats with a cloth, and a bad shave could leave a gentleman mark for days, which for a dandy was a catastrophe roughly on par with losing a limb. You lather up, tilt your chin toward the light, and begin the slow, deliberate work. This was not a task to be rushed. Every stroke had to be measured, following the grain, chasing smoothness into every hollow and along every stubborn ridge of jaw. It demanded a steady hand and a clear head, which is deeply unfair given how the previous night had gone. But the dandy shaved anyway, with the grim focus of a man diffusing something delicate because a smooth face was not negotiable. And then, because merely shaving was for lesser men, came the plucking. Once the razor had done its broad work, you took up a pair of tweezers and went hunting. Any stray hair that had dared to survive, any little rebel sprouting where it should not, was seized and yanked out by the root, one at a time, with the patience of a saint and the pettiness of a tyrant. Imagine grooming so obsessive that you personally tracked down individual hairs and executed them. It's the kind of attention to detail that in any other context would suggest a man with far too much time on his hands, which of course was exactly the impression you were going for. Think of it as the difference between wiping down a counter and going after a single crumb with a magnifying glass and a pair of forceps. Nobody sane would do the second thing, but you were not aiming for sane. You were aiming for flawless, and flawless lives entirely in the details that ordinary men never even notice. The whole philosophy of the dandy rested on this, that greatness was hidden in the tiny things, the stray hair, the crooked fold, the smudge on a glove, and that a truly superior man attended to all of them. There was naturally no numbing anything, no soothing balm to take the sting away, at least nothing we would recognize as effective. Just cold water, a bracing splash, and the stoic acceptance that beauty required a little suffering delivered by your own hand. You endured it the way you endured the tight coats and the tighter finances, with a serene expression that betrayed nothing. At last the face is done, scraped, plucked, and buffed into something as smooth and untroubled as a river stone. You look, once again, effortless, which by now you understand is the biggest lie of all. But the true trial of the morning still lies ahead, wound in a long strip of starched white cloth, waiting on the dressing table like a patient adversary. It is time to face the cravat. And now we arrive at the true test, the summit of the dandy's morning, the item that could make or break a reputation before 9 in the morning, the cravat. This was a long strip of starched white muslin or linen wound around the throat, and tied into a knot so precise it deserved its own diplomatic recognition. There were named styles, real ones, catalogued and satirized in the fashion press, styles with grand titles like the Mathematical, the Oriental, and the Napoleon. Tying one correctly was a delicate dance of starch, patience, and sheer nerve, because the fabric had exactly one shot as perfection. Understand what you were working with. The cravat was starch stiff, sometimes stiff enough that a man could barely turn his head, which was rather the point, since it forced you into that lofty, chin-elevated posture that made a dandy look as though he were perpetually smelling something slightly beneath him. That stiffness was your friend and your enemy. It held the shape you fought so hard to create. But it also meant the cloth was pitiless. Fold it wrong and it would not forgive you. Crease it at the wrong angle and there was no smoothing it out. The starch remembered everything. The tying itself was a performance of held breath and steady fingers. You would drape the strip around your neck and then, working entirely by feel and by the reflection in your mirror, you would begin the slow architecture of the knot. Some men lowered their chins gradually to press the folds into place, sculpting the fabric with their own jaw, a technique that sounds absurd and was absolutely real. One wrong movement, one careless exhale, and the whole thing collapsed into a crumpled ruin fit only for the discard pile. Ah, yes, the discard pile. This is the detail that tells you everything about the madness of it all. The legend goes that a visitor once called on the great Beau himself and found the floor of his dressing room littered with a small snowdrift of crumpled white neckcloths. When the visitor asked what on earth they were, the valet replied with perfect funereal gravity that these, sir, were their failures. Their failures. An entire heap of ruined linen, each one representing a knot that had not achieved perfection, each one abandoned in the pursuit of a single flawless result. It is the 18th century equivalent of taking 50 photographs to post one, except the 50 rejects are piling up on your floor in real time while a man watches. Consider the pressure of this. The cravat sat directly beneath your face, framing it. The very first thing anyone's eye landed on. A magnificent coat could not save a disgraceful neckcloth. It was the centerpiece, the keystone, the one element that announced instantly whether you were a true man of fashion or a hopeless pretender playing dress-up. Everything came down to those folds, and so men practiced. They studied. They copied the knots of their betters and invented new ones to be copied in turn. A gentleman who could produce a novel, elegant cravat arrangement might see it spread across London and immortalised in the satirical pamphlets that catalogued every fashionable knot with mock seriousness. To have a style associated with your name was a kind of immortality, achieved through nothing more than the artful strangling of your own throat. By the time your cravat sits correctly, crisp and sculptural and blinding white, you have spent a genuinely alarming portion of your morning in single combat with a piece of cloth, and you have emerged this time victorious. You touch it once gently, and vow not to move your neck too suddenly for the rest of the day. Speaking of that white, we should talk about just how insanely white it had to be. Let's talk about your shirt, or rather, the shirts, plural, because a single one will not survive the demands of your lifestyle. To the dandy, the colour of one's linen was not a detail. It was a moral position. Your shirt, your cravat, your collar had to be a white so pure, so blinding, so aggressively spotless that it looked as though it had never touched human skin. Not cream, not ivory, not the sad greyish white of a garment that has met a real laundry. We're talking fresh snow, angel wing, freshly fallen white. Now think about the city you live in. London in this era is a place of coal fires by the thousand, of smoke hanging in the streets, of soot drifting down like grim confetti and settling on everything it touches. The air itself is a conspiracy against clean linen. Step outside for an hour and the atmosphere will do its patient best to smudge you into the general greyness of everyone else. Keeping your whites truly white in such a place was not a matter of doing laundry now and then. It was open warfare against the very air you breathed. Winning that war required an army. Behind your dazzling shirt front stood laundresses labouring over tubs of hot water, wielding soap and lye and vast quantities of starch, scrubbing and boiling and pressing until the fabric surrendered into perfection. This was brutal, red-knuckled work, and it was invisible, performed out of sight so that you could stroll into a drawing room looking as though whiteness was simply your natural state. The elegance you wore so casually was built on somebody else's aching hands, a fact you were careful never to think about too hard. And because London's grime never rested, neither could you. A proper gentleman might change his linen more than once in a single day, peeling off a shirt that had committed the crime of looking slightly less than immaculate and replacing it with a fresh one. Sweat, soot, the ordinary insults of the day, all of it accumulated and all of it had to be banished. Your dirty laundry, piling up faster than most men could afford to launder, became a paradoxical badge of honour. The more you soiled, the more you must be changing, and the more you changed, the grander you clearly were. Here is the delicious absurdity of it. In your world, filthy laundry was proof of cleanliness. A towering heap of shirts awaiting the wash did not mean you were a slob. It meant you were so fastidious, so committed to freshness, that you burned through pristine garments at a rate ordinary men could never sustain. It was consumption as display, waste as wealth, the same impulse that today makes people flaunt how much of something expensive they can afford to use up. The cost of all this was, predictably, ruinous. Fine linen was not cheap. An army of laundresses did not work for free. Multiple changes a day meant multiple shirts, dozens of them, each one an investment, and the bills for their care alone could stagger a modest fortune. But a dandy did not concern himself with such vulgar sums, at least not out loud, not until the creditors came knocking, which we will get to. For now, you button yourself into linen of impossible whiteness, feeling it crisp and cool and faintly stiff against your freshly scrubbed skin, radiating a purity that quietly insults everyone in the room. The foundation garments are on, the face is smooth, the neck is sculpted, the linen glows. Now comes the part where the clothes stop being comfortable, because it is time to get properly, punishingly dressed. Now it's finally time to put on your clothes, and I use the phrase put on very generously, because a dandy did not so much wear his garments as get poured into them. The whole philosophy here was fit, and more fit, where the flamboyant fops of the past drowned themselves in embroidery, jewels, and enough lace to curtain a cathedral. The dandy went the opposite direction. His power came not from decoration, but from tailoring so exact, so sculpted to the body, that the clothes appear to have grown there naturally. Begin with the coat, and understand that it was engineered rather than sewn. A master tailor cut it to trace the exact lines of your shoulders, your chest, your back, sometimes with careful padding built in to correct whatever nature had failed to provide, broadening a narrow shoulder here, smoothing an awkward line there. The result was meant to look like the body of an idealized man, and if your actual body fell short of the ideal, well, that is what the padding and the cut were for. You were, in a very real sense, a collaboration between yourself and your tailor, and the tailor did most of the heavy lifting. The fit was so close that movement became a genuine problem. A coat cut this snug did not allow for anything so undignified as reaching, stretching, or lifting your arms much above your shoulders. Sitting had to be managed carefully. Bending was a negotiation. Some coats were so tight across the back that a gentleman needed help getting into them, his valet easing him in one arm at a time like a knight being fitted for armour, which, in terms of mobility, was not far off. Breeches and legwear were held to the same merciless standard. They had to cling smoothly, without a wrinkle, without a sag, without a single betraying bulge or bag at the knee. A wrinkle in the wrong place was not a minor flaw. It was evidence of failure, a crack in the illusion of the perfectly turned-out man. Everything was pulled taut, tucked, and smoothed until you resembled less a person who had dressed, and more a figure that had been upholstered. The layers built up in a precise sequence, shirt, then waistcoat, then coat, each one adding to the sculpted silhouette, each one requiring its own careful adjustment. The waistcoat had to sit just so, showing the correct amount beneath the coat. The coat had to close, or artfully not close exactly as fashion dictated. There was a right way and 1,000 wrong ways, and the difference between them was invisible to the untrained eye and blindingly obvious to everyone who mattered. The comparison that lands best is the modern tailored suit taken to a deranged extreme. We admire a well-fitted jacket today, but we still expect to breathe, sit, and raise a fork. The dandy accepted no such compromises. Comfort was simply not on the menu. If looking magnificent required you to move like a marionette with tangled strings and sit bolt upright all evening, then that was the price, cheerfully paid, or at least paid with a face that betrayed nothing. And this was the whole trick, the sleight of hand at the heart of the dandy's craft. All this engineering, all this padding and tugging and near immobilizing tightness was meant to produce an impression of complete natural ease, as though you had simply been born looking this good and the clothes had thoughtfully arranged themselves around your perfection. Effortless once again, achieved through staggering effort. Fully dressed, you stand rigid and resplendent, unable to fully bend at the middle and entirely at peace with that fact. But before we admire the finished silhouette, we should address a small structural secret laced tightly beneath it all. Here's a little secret the paintings won't tell you. Underneath all that crisp, sculpted perfection, plenty of fashionable gentlemen were laced into corsets. That's right, stays, whalebone. The same body-shaping torture devices we associate with women were also quietly cinching the waistlines of vain men across London, up to and including the very Prince Regent himself, who was fond of a fashionably narrow silhouette despite an increasingly unfashionable appetite. The logic, if we can call it that, was airtight. The dandy's entire look depended on a coat that fit like a coat of paint, and a waist that tapered elegantly beneath a broad chest. But bodies, being bodies, do not always cooperate with fashion. Good living, rich food, endless wine, and long nights at the card table have a way of settling around the middle, and when your midsection began to spread while your silhouette demanded that it not, there was really only one solution available, and it involved a great deal of whalebone and a servant willing to pull. So into the stays you went. These were stiff garments boned with strips of whalebone, that flexible, resilient material harvested from the mouths of whales, and used to give structure to everything that needed to hold a shape against the stubborn softness of flesh. Laced up the back, they compressed the waist, flattened the belly, and forced the torso into the fashionable line. Getting into them was not a solo endeavour. A gentleman would grip something solid while his servant hauled on the laces, cinching him tighter and tighter, the two of them working like a sailor in a capstan to bring the anchor of his waistline under control. The results were undeniable, but the costs were real. A man laced too tightly could not eat much, could not breathe deeply, and in a warm, crowded room might find the world going gently swimmy at the edges before he crumpled gracefully to the floor. The fashionable feint was a genuine hazard, and while it was politely blamed on the heat, the stuffiness, or the crush of the crowd, everyone with a shred of sense knew the real culprit was the vice of whalebone squeezing the air out of the poor man's lungs. The satirists, of course, could not believe their luck. Caricaturists sketched dandies with delighted cruelty, drawing them being winched into their corsets by straining servants, their faces purple, their bellies overflowing above and below the laces like dough escaping a too small tin. The image of the vain man crushed into shape by his own vanity was simply too good to resist, and the prince sold merrily, mocking the very men who set the fashions everyone else scrambled to follow. There is something wonderfully human in all this. We tend to imagine these gentlemen as effortlessly slender creatures gliding through ballrooms, but a good number of them were, in truth, ordinary men fighting the same losing battle against their own waistlines that people fight to this day, only with fewer options and far more whalebone. The narrow sculpted figure admired across the drawing room was frequently a construction, an illusion held together by lacing and grit, and the quiet suffering of a man who could not quite manage to bend over. So as you stand there, ribs gently protesting, breath shallow, forbidden from anything so reckless as a full inhale, take comfort that you're in exalted company, all the way up to the future king. The price of the perfect line was measured in comfort, in dignity, and occasionally in consciousness. And speaking of the line, we still have not settled the great question troubling the fashionable leg: what exactly to wear below the waist? Let's move down to the legs, where a quiet revolution was underway. For generations, a well-bred man wore knee breeches, buttoned snugly below the knee, paired with stockings that showed off a shapely calf, because apparently a good calf was once a genuine selling point in a husband. But fashion was shifting beneath your very feet. Enter pantaloons, skin-tight legwear stretched over the leg like a coat of paint, and the increasingly popular trousers, longer garments that draped all the way down to the ankle. Consider the old world first, the world of knee breeches, because it explains what the new fashions were rebelling against. Breeches ended at the knee, leaving the lower leg on display in stockings, and this meant a gentleman's calf was public property, judged and admired like any other feature. A man blessed with a fine, muscular calf could strut with confidence, while a man cursed with a spindly one might resort to padding to fill out the shape, because heaven forbid anyone glimpse an inadequate leg. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how much attention was once paid to the humble calf, a body part most modern people have never once thought about in their lives. Now, the pantaloon. These were the athleisure of their day, if athleisure required you to be sewn in. Cut to cling to the leg with almost indecent closeness, they traced every line from hip to ankle, and achieving that skin-tight effect took some doing. They might be made from stretchy knitted fabric, or cut on a clever bias to hug the form, and legend insists that the truly committed would dampen them and pull them on wet, then let them dry moulded to the leg like a very fashionable second skin. The image of a grown man wriggling into damp trousers so they would shrink onto him is one of the great overlooked comedies of the era. Then came trousers proper, longer and looser than pantaloons, falling all the way to the ankle and pointing quietly toward the future of menswear. Trousers were the new thing, the daring thing, the choice of the forward-looking man of fashion, and they carried a faint whiff of rebellion precisely because they broke with the old order of breeches. To wear them was to signal that you moved with the times, that you were on the leading edge of taste rather than clinging to the styles of your grandfather. But, and this is crucial, the old order did not surrender quietly. In the most rigid strongholds of high society, knee breeches remained not merely preferred but strictly mandatory, a rule enforced with a seriousness that bordered on the ridiculous. Certain hallowed rooms would not admit a man in trousers under any circumstances, no matter his rank, his fame, or his impeccable everything else. Show up in the wrong legwear, and you would be turned away at the door like a stranger, a humiliation we will explore in full when we reach those famously merciless assembly rooms. So your choice of what to wear below the waist was not a trivial one. It was a small daily declaration of allegiance. Breeches said tradition, formality, respect for the way things had always been done. Pantaloons and trousers said modernity, boldness, a willingness to lead rather than follow. And a canny dandy read the room, knowing which battlefield he was walking onto and dressing his legs accordingly, because the wrong decision could bar the door or brand him a relic. You settle on your legwear, ease into it with the appropriate struggle, and admire the clean, unbroken line running all the way down. Nearly complete now, But a man's outfit, however perfect above, could be entirely undone by what he put on his feet, and dandy footwear demanded a shine bordering on the supernatural. No dandy outfit was complete without the footwear, and here the standards reached a shine so intense it practically became a personality. Tall, gleaming Hessian boots with their little decorative tassels, or sleek top boots for the country set, all buffed to a mirror finish so flawless you could check your cravat in the reflection. Achieving that shine was a dark art guarded by valets, and legend insists the most fashionable gentlemen demanded their boot polish be mixed with champagne, because ordinary blacking was simply not extravagant enough for a man whose shoes cost more than a labourer earned in a year. Start with the boots themselves, because they were serious pieces of craftsmanship. Hessian boots rose to just below the knee, cut into a graceful curve at the front and finished with a jaunty little tassel dangling at the top, a style borrowed from military fashion and adopted by gentlemen who had never come within 100 miles of a battlefield. Top boots, favoured for riding and country pursuits, sported a contrasting band of paler leather around the upper edge, a look that said sporting country gentleman even on a man who could barely stay on a horse. Both were made of fine leather, fitted closely to the leg, and priced to make your eyes water. But owning the boots was only the beginning. The true obsession was the shine. A dandy's boots had to gleam like polished glass, reflecting the world around them, catching the light with every step, utterly free of scuff or dullness, or the ordinary wear of walking on actual streets. This was not a shine you achieved with a quick buff on the back of your trouser leg. This was a shine that required labour, expertise, and secret recipes, the composition of a good blacking being the sort of thing valets guarded like a family treasure. And this is where the champagne enters the legend. The story, repeated with great relish ever since, holds that the most exacting dandies insisted their boot polish be blended with champagne, because plain blacking was simply beneath the dignity of their footwear. Whether the bubbles genuinely improved the gleam, or whether it was pure, glorious extravagance is almost beside the point. What matters is that men were said to be pouring good wine into their shoe polish, an act so magnificently wasteful that it perfectly captures the whole absurd spirit of the thing. Somewhere a bootmaker was going unpaid while his customer marinated his boots in vintage. Picture the arithmetic of it. Here is a man who may owe his tailor a small fortune, who dodges his creditors down side streets, whose entire fashionable existence teeters on a mountain of credit, and yet he will insist, absolutely insist, that his boot polish contain champagne. The finances of the dandy make no sense whatsoever until you accept the core principle. Appearances were everything, and money was nothing, right up until the terrible morning when money turned out to be everything after all. The care did not stop at polishing. Boots had to be maintained, protected, treated with the reverence due to sacred objects. A valet might spend a considerable part of his day tending to his master's footwear, coaxing out the shine, guarding against the mud and filth of the city that lay in wait for every step. To scuff a boot was a small tragedy. To be seen in dull, neglected leather was to confess to the world that you had given up, and so you slide your feet into boots that shine like dark mirrors, faintly, ludicrously, possibly scented with the ghost of champagne, and the transformation is complete. Scrubbed, shaved, laced, tailored, and gleaming from throat to toe, you are ready at last to step out into the world and do the one thing all of this was for. But before you can dazzle the streets, there remains the small matter of the coat, and choosing it correctly was its own quiet act of genius. Now for the crown jewel of the whole ensemble, the coat, and this is where the dandy's genius truly reveals itself. You might expect a man this obsessed with appearance to drape himself in gold thread and jewel tones. Wrong. The dandy's masterstroke was restraint. Deep, sober colours, midnight blue, bottle green, and above all black. No sparkle, no flash, no clownish rainbow. Just impeccable cloth, cut by a master, in colours so understated they practically dared you to look closer. To grasp how radical this was, you have to remember what came before. The previous generation of fashionable men had dressed like walking chandeliers, draped in shimmering silks, embroidered from collar to hem, powdered, patched, and glittering with enough decoration to outshine a church altar. They believed quite sincerely that magnificence meant more colour, more embroidery, more everything. A gentleman announced his importance by covering himself in expensive proof of it, the way a peacock settles all arguments simply by unfolding. The dandy looked at all that shimmering excess and quietly decided it was vulgar. His rebellion was not to add but to subtract. He stripped the colour out, banished the embroidery, and stood there in plain dark wool, and in doing so he made every gaudy man in the room look like he was trying far too hard. It was a devastating move, because it could not be beaten by spending more money. You cannot outsparkle a man who has decided that sparkle itself is beneath him. The message buried in that dark, sober cloth was pure, elegant savagery. It said, "Any fool with a full purse can buy bright silk and cover himself in gold. It takes a truly superior being to command a room wearing nothing but flawless plain wool that simply happens to fit like a dream." The power had moved from the fabric to the man, from the decoration to the cut, and only those with genuine taste could tell the difference between an ordinary black coat and a perfect one. That, of course, was the entire point, and the difference was real, even if it was invisible to the untrained eye. Two coats might both be black, both be plain, and yet one would hang like a divine judgment while the other merely covered a torso. The quality lived in the wool, the cut, the set of the shoulders, the fall of the skirts, 1,000 small perfections that only a connoisseur could name but that everyone could somehow feel. You were forcing the room to look closer, to notice quality rather than quantity, and that shift was the dandy's lasting revolution. Here is the modern echo, and you already know it in your bones. It is the reason a plain, beautifully cut piece of clothing in a quiet colour can outclass something loud and logo-covered and far more expensive. It is the whole idea that real elegance whispers while cheap taste shouts, that the most confident thing in any room is often the simplest. That instinct did not always exist. It was invented more or less by these men, in these coats, out of sheer competitive contempt for the peacocks who came before them. So you shrug into your dark, perfect coat, feeling it settle onto your shoulders like it was grown there, and you understand that you are not underdressed. You are the most dangerous kind of dressed, the kind that makes everyone else suddenly doubt their own reflection. Now, at last, the head requires attention, and even your hair was engineered to look like you had never thought about it once. Let's deal with the hair, which, like everything else about you, is a carefully engineered illusion of not caring. Just a few decades earlier, a fashionable head was buried under a mountain of powdered wig, dusted white with starch until it looked like a snowdrift with opinions. But those days were dying, hastened along by a government tax on hair powder that made frosted heads suddenly far less appealing to the wallet. So the dandy went natural, sort of. The wig, in its heyday, had been a monument to artifice. Towering, powdered, sometimes greased and built up over frames into shapes that defied both gravity and common sense. It was the ultimate statement that a gentleman need not resemble anything so ordinary as a human being. Powder rained from these constructions in a constant fine drizzle, coating shoulders and furniture, and maintaining one was a filthy, expensive, absurd business. And then a clever government, always alert to a new way of parting the rich from their money, slapped a tax on the very powder that made it all possible, and the fashion began to die almost overnight. Into this vacuum stepped the dandy, and his solution was, on the surface, simplicity itself. Real hair, your own, cut and arranged into styles with romantic names borrowed from the busts of ancient Rome, tousled and swept forward in artful disarray, meant to evoke a noble simplicity, as though you were less a man of fashion and more a philosopher who simply happened to look incredible. The powder was gone, the wig was gone. In their place, a head of natural hair, casually perfect, except, of course, it was not casual at all. That windswept, just-so tumble of curls was the product of considerable labour, coaxed into shape with combs, damp fingers, and a good deal of standing before the mirror muttering. The whole effect was designed to look accidental, as though you had run a hand through your hair while thinking about something more important and simply happened to land on perfection. In reality, it was as choreographed as everything else. Another performance of effortlessness that cost real effort. Then there was the matter of oil. To give the hair its fashionable shine and to tame it into obedience, gentlemen slathered their locks in scented oils, and they applied them with enthusiasm. So much enthusiasm, in fact, that a new domestic problem was born. Men would lean their well-oiled heads back against the fine upholstered chairs of drawing rooms and clubs, and the grease would soak into the fabric, leaving a permanent dark smudge exactly where a fashionable head had rested. The solution was a little protective cloth draped over the back of every good chair, a small square of fabric whose entire reason for existing was to absorb the drippings of vain men. Pause on that. A whole category of household linen came into being purely to defend the furniture from the hair products of dandies. It is one of those tiny, ridiculous details that tells you more about an era than any grand history, the quiet testimony of 1,000 greasy chairbacks across fashionable London. So you finish your hair, artfully wrecked and gleaming with scented oil, looking as though you rolled out of bed a natural wonder, when in truth you have been at it for a good while. The illusion is nearly complete now, head to boot. All that remains are the small final flourishes, the little props that turn a well-dressed man into a fully armed one. Before you can face the world, we need the accessories, the small props that turn a well-dressed man into a proper performance. First, gloves, spotless and snug, and a serious dandy might change them several times a day, because a smudged glove was a personal failing. Then a walking cane, not because you needed help walking, but because a cane gave your hand something elegant to do and could be twirled, leaned upon, or pointed with meaningful disdain. And finally, the true weapon of the fashionable snob, the quizzing glass. Begin with the gloves, because they were the perfect little tyranny. Made of fine, pale leather, fitted so closely that pulling them on was its own small ceremony, they had to be immaculate at all times. A glove that had picked up a smudge, a stain, a mark from the grubby world, was an emergency, and the solution was simply to change them, again and again, throughout the day. A gentleman might go through several pairs before nightfall, each swap another quiet expense, another small proof that he lived at a level of freshness ordinary men could not sustain. Your hands, like your linen, were a battlefield in the endless war against London's grime. Then the cane, that most gloriously unnecessary of objects. You did not need it to walk. You were a young man in the prime of life, not a doddering elder. The cane existed for entirely different reasons. It gave your hands a purpose, something graceful to hold, to twirl between your fingers, to plant before you as you paused mid-stroll. It could be leaned upon with studied nonchalance. It could be raised to gesture, or pointed, ever so slightly, at something or someone you wish to dismiss. It was punctuation for the body, a prop that turned ordinary standing about into a series of elegant poses. And now, the crown of the accessories, the quizzing glass. Picture a single lens mounted on a handle, often hung on a ribbon around the neck, and picture the ritual of its use. You would spot a person, perhaps a rival, perhaps a hopeful nobody, and you would slowly raise the glass to one eye. Then you would look, not a glance, but a long, deliberate inspection, head to toe, taking in every detail of their dress and bearing through that magnifying lens, before lowering the glass again with an expression of faint, unmistakable judgment. You had examined them, the way a naturalist examines a curious beetle, and found them wanting. It was, in essence, the art of looking someone up and down, but formalized, weaponized, and equipped with an optical instrument so that the target could not possibly miss your meaning. To be quizzed by the wrong dandy in the wrong room was a small public execution. There was no ambiguity in it. The slow lift of the glass, the unhurried inspection, the cool lowering, all of it announced with perfect clarity. I have looked at you closely, and I remain unimpressed. These props, taken together, transformed you from a man who was merely well-dressed into a man who was fully operational. The gloves proved your fastidiousness. The cane gave your idle body elegance. The quizzing glass armed you for social combat. Each was a tool, and a dandy without his tools was only half himself, a beautifully dressed figure with nothing to do with his hands and no way to deliver a proper snub. At last you're complete, scrubbed, sculpted, tailored, gleaming, gloved and armed. There is nothing left to do in these rooms. It is time, finally, to step out into the daylight and perform the one act that all of this was ever truly about. It is time to be seen. At last you emerge, blinking into the daylight, and now comes the entire point of all that labour. Being looked at. The fashionable streets of London, Bond Street chief among them, were less a place to buy things and more an open-air stage where the beautiful people paraded up and down for the sole purpose of seeing and being seen. This was the promenade, and it had unwritten rules more complex than any dance. Set the scene properly, certain streets, at certain hours, filled with the fashionable set, all of them out on foot, all of them dressed to the teeth, all of them pretending they were simply taking the air while in fact conducting a fierce and silent competition. The shops were there, the window displays glittered, but shopping was almost a pretext. The real business was the parade itself, the slow river of magnificent people flowing along the pavements, each one a moving exhibition of taste, wealth, and studied indifference. The pace was everything, and it was slow. To hurry was to confess that you had somewhere to be, some obligation, some purpose beyond leisure, and nothing could be more damning for a man whose entire brand was that he did not work and never rushed. So you strolled, unhurried, serene, drifting along at the exact speed of a man with infinite time and nowhere in particular to spend it. Your walk itself was a statement, and the statement was, I am at leisure, gloriously, and you are witnessing it. Then there was the intricate choreography of acknowledgement. As you drifted along, you would encounter people, and every encounter demanded a split-second judgment. Whom do you greet, and how warmly? Whom do you favour with a nod? Whom with a full and gracious bow? And whom do you sail straight past as though they were a lamppost? These decisions were watched, noted, and remembered. A warm greeting could lift a person standing. A cold non-acknowledgement could puncture it. You were dispensing social currency with every step, and you spent it carefully. You also had to manage your own display, presenting yourself to the street from your best angles, letting the daylight catch the perfect fall of your coat and the blinding white of your linen, wearing your carefully constructed self as though you were entirely unaware of it. That was the great trick, to be flawlessly turned out and yet appear utterly unconscious of the fact, as if you simply always looked this way and had never once considered that anyone might be looking. The looking, naturally, was the whole point, but a dandy must never seem to notice it. So devoted were some men to this ritual of decorative loitering that they became known by it, earning a nickname for their habit of draping themselves along the fashionable streets, doing precisely nothing of substance. To lounge, to stroll, to be seen, to see and to pass judgment, this was a full occupation, pursued with a seriousness that would be baffling if it were not so recognisable. We have all seen the modern version, the careful arrangement of a public self, the stroll that is secretly a performance, the effortless look that took an hour to build. Understand what you were really doing out there. You were not walking down the street. You were presenting yourself to it, offering the city the gift of your appearance and expecting, quite reasonably in your view, that the city be grateful. And the fashionable world, for its part, played along, because everyone strolling that pavement was doing exactly the same thing, performing for an audience that was itself performing. But a stroll like this could not happen without the men who made you look this way, the true architects of the illusion, and they were beginning to wonder when, exactly, you intended to pay them. Behind every legendary dandy stood a small army of tradesmen who actually made the magic happen, and chief among them was the tailor. The great tailoring houses of London were the true wizards of this world, men who could cut and stitch a coat so exquisitely that a nobody could walk into a room and outdress a duke. Gentlemen were fiercely loyal to their tailors, treated them almost like collaborators in a shared masterpiece, and would discuss the hang of a sleeve with the gravity of generals planning a campaign. Let us give these men their due, because they were genuine artists. A master tailor understood the body the way a sculptor understands stone, seeing not what was there but what could be coaxed out of it. He knew where to pad, where to nip, where to let the cloth fall and where to hold it firm. He could take an ordinary man of no particular shape and through cut and craft alone send him out into the world looking like an idealized version of himself. This was not sewing. It was transformation, and the best of them were sought after, celebrated and courted like the powerful figures they quietly were. The relationship between a dandy and his tailor was oddly intimate. You returned to the same man again and again, and he came to know your body, your posture, your particular flaws and how to disguise them. Fittings were serious occasions conducted with murmured concentration, the tailor circling you with pins and chalk while you discussed the precise angle of a lapel or the exact fall of a skirt as though the fate of nations hung upon it. In a sense, the two of you were partners in a single ongoing masterpiece, which was the public illusion of you. There was, however, one small recurring difficulty in this beautiful partnership: payment. The entire dandy economy ran not on money-changing hands, but on credit, on the gentlemanly understanding that a fashionable customer's account would be settled eventually at some vague and ever-receding point in the future. A gentleman did not soil the elegance of a fitting by talking about anything so grubby as the bill. He simply ordered and wore, and ordered again, and the amounts owed grew quietly in the tailor's ledger like a slow tide. The tailors, for their part, extended these enormous lines of credit with a mixture of pride and prayer. There was prestige in dressing the famous dandies, in having the leading men of fashion seen in your coats, and that prestige drew in other, more reliable customers, so the tailor gambled, clothing men of dazzling reputation and dubious solvency, betting that the honour of the association or the eventual settling of the account would make it worthwhile. Sometimes it did, often it did not, and the craftsman was left holding beautiful unpaid invoices for garments worn to 100 parties he could never have afforded to attend. It is a strange and slightly melancholy picture when you look at it directly. The most magnificent men in London, admired and envied and copied, floated through society draped in the labour of tradesmen they were quietly ruining. The gleaming boots, the perfect coats, the blinding linen, all of it built on the patience and unpaid toil of people whose names history barely records. The dandy took the glory, the tailor took the risk, and risk, of course, has a way of eventually coming due, for the tradesman and, in time, for the gentleman too. But those grim reckonings lay in the future. For now the debts were still just numbers in a ledger, and there was a far more pressing appointment to keep. The club was calling, and the best seat in the house was waiting. Every dandy needed a headquarters, a private kingdom where the vulgar public could not follow, and that meant the gentlemen's club. These were exclusive institutions where fashionable men gathered to eat, drink, gamble, gossip, and refine the delicate craft of looking down on everyone else. At the most legendary of them stood a piece of furniture that became a throne, a great curved bow window overlooking the street. First, understand the nature of the club itself. It was a refuge, a fortress of exclusivity, a place where a man could shed the performance of the public streets and relax into the company of his own kind, which is to say other fashionable men equally devoted to leisure and judgment. Membership was carefully controlled, admission jealously guarded, and once inside you were among the elect. The world outside, with its tradesmen and its crowds and its creditors, could not reach you here. Within these walls you were safe to lounge, to drink, to talk, and above all to be exclusive together. The clubs offered every comfort a gentleman of leisure could require. Fine food and finer wine, newspapers and easy chairs, card rooms where fortunes changed hands, endless hours to be filled with conversation and idleness. But the true currency of the club was not money or wine, it was belonging. To be a member of the right club was to be certified as one of the fashionable, and to be excluded was to be nobody, no matter your wealth or rank. The club was a machine for sorting the world into those who mattered and those who did not. And within the grandest of these clubs stood the single most coveted spot in all of fashionable London, the great bow window jutting out over the street. This curved bay, added to the front of the building, became the throne room of the dandies. From within it, seated in comfort, the reigning men of fashion could observe the whole passing parade of the city, watching the world flow by while remaining safely, gloriously apart from it, framed in glass like the most important exhibit in a museum of taste. To sit in that window was the ultimate arrival. It was not a seat you could buy or demand. It was granted by custom and by the tacit approval of the men who already sat there to those deemed worthy of the fashionable elite. The great arbiter of the age presided over that window, and to be invited into its company was to be officially recognised as one of the truly important. Dukes might walk the street below. The men in the window decided whether those dukes were dressed correctly. Consider the strange geometry of it. An ordinary shop window puts goods on display for the people outside to admire. This window did the reverse. It put the fashionable men on display, yes, but it was they who did the judging, peering out at the passing crowd and delivering silent verdicts on everyone who walked by. The people outside were the exhibit, the men inside were the critics. To be seen from the pavement, seated in that glass, was to be marked as someone the critics had accepted, and the power that flowed from that window was genuine, however absurd its source. A raised eyebrow, a murmured remark, a decision about who was and was not worth acknowledging, all of it rippled out through society and shaped reputations. The men in the bow window did not govern the country, did not command armies, did not hold high office. They simply sat and drank and judged, and somehow that was enough to make them feared. So you take your place, if you are grand enough to have earned it, and settle in to do the real work of the dandy, which is to say almost nothing magnificently. Once installed in his club, the true dandy did something remarkable. Almost nothing, and did it magnificently. His power did not come from wealth, title, or accomplishment. It came from taste, from the sheer force of his opinions on what was and was not acceptable. Dukes and lords would actually seek his approval, anxiously asking whether their coat passed muster, whether their cravat was correct, whether they were, in a word, done properly, and the dandy, lounging with an air of eternal boredom, would deliver his verdict, and society would obey. Let us be clear about how genuinely strange this arrangement was. The men seeking approval were, on paper, vastly more important than the man granting it. They had ancient titles, great estates, seats of real power, bloodlines stretching back centuries. The arbiter of taste, meanwhile, frequently had none of these things, being a man of modest origins who had risen on nothing but style and nerve, and yet the powerful came to him, anxious and hopeful, submitting their appearance for his judgment like schoolboys presenting homework to a stern master. The whole natural order of rank had been quietly turned upside down, and everyone simply went along with it. The dandy's authority rested entirely on the belief, shared by all the right people, that his judgment about matters of taste was simply correct in a way that could not be argued with. He had cultivated an air of infallibility, a serene certainty about what was elegant and what was dreadful, and he dispensed his opinions with such cool conviction that others accepted them as fact. If he pronounced a style vulgar, it became vulgar. If he approved of a cut, that cut was suddenly in demand. He was a one-man authority on the acceptable, and his rulings were obeyed as though they carried the force of law. His manner in delivering these verdicts was itself an art. He did not gush, didn't enthuse, did not stoop to anything so eager as delight. He lounged. He appeared perpetually, elegantly bored, as though the entire spectacle of society were a mild diversion beneath his full attention. From this posture of magnificent ennui, he would let fall his judgments, a raised eyebrow here, a cool word there, a long silence that spoke louder than any speech. The less he seemed to care, the more everyone else cared what he thought, which is a paradox as true today as it was then. Think about what he had actually built. Out of nothing more than confidence, taste, and impeccable presentation, he had constructed a throne. He had convinced the most powerful people in the country that being the best dressed, most quietly cutting man in the room was a form of genuine authority, worth courting and fearing. It was, when you examine it coldly, one of the most audacious confidence tricks in social history, and its brilliance lay in the fact that everyone was in on it, and it worked anyway. The comparison to the present is almost too easy. We still, all of us, grant a strange power to the arbiters of taste, the people who seem to simply know what is cool and what is not, whose approval we crave and whose disdain we dread, even when they hold no formal power over us whatsoever. The dandy was the original version of this, the founding member of a club that has never stopped admitting new members, the man who proved that taste, wielded with enough confidence, could be turned into a kind of rule. And a ruler needs subjects, which means he also needs a way to punish the ones who displease him. The dandy had such a punishment, exquisite in its cruelty and requiring not a single raised voice or lifted hand. It was called the cut. In your glittering world, the deadliest weapon was not a sword or a pistol. It was the refusal to acknowledge that someone existed. This was the art of the snub, refined into a whole-ranked system of social annihilation. The gentlest version was simply failing to notice an acquaintance. But the true kill shot, the nuclear option, was known as the cut direct, looking a person squarely in the eye, in full view of everyone who mattered, and then deliberately turning away as if they were a smudge on the air. To understand the power of the cut, you have to understand how starved this society was for acknowledgement. Everything ran on recognition, on the small exchanges of nods and bows and greetings that constantly reaffirmed who was in and who mattered. To be greeted warmly by the right people was to be woven securely into the fabric of society. Your very existence, socially speaking, was confirmed moment by moment through the acknowledgement of others, and that meant the withdrawal of acknowledgement was not a mere slight. It was a kind of erasure. The snub came in grades, like a menu of cruelty. At the mild end, you might simply fail to notice someone, letting your gaze drift past them as though distracted, a gentle message that they were not quite worth your attention today. This could be waved away, perhaps, as absent-mindedness, but it planted a seed of doubt in the victim and in everyone watching about exactly where that person stood. Then there was the full and terrible cut direct, the masterpiece of the form. This required eye contact first, a clear, unmistakable moment in which you looked directly at the person, so that there could be no pretending you had failed to see them, and then, having established beyond all doubt that you saw them perfectly well, you turned away, deliberately, cold, as though what you had seen was not a person at all but an empty patch of air, a nothing, a nobody unworthy of even the smallest flicker of recognition. Delivered in a crowded room, before the eyes of all the people who mattered, it was devastating. The genius of it was that it broke no rules and could not be answered. There was no insult to object to, no blow to return, no words to dispute. You had done nothing but decline to greet someone, which is not a crime, and yet everyone present understood exactly what had happened. They had watched a person be publicly unpersoned, watched their standing collapse in the space of a single turned shoulder. The victim could not fight it without appearing hysterical, could not protest without confirming their own diminishment. They could only stand there, freshly erased, and feel the room's judgment settle over them. A well-delivered cut from the right dandy could genuinely damage a reputation, sending an ambitious climber tumbling back down the ladder they had worked so hard to ascend. Doors that had been opening would quietly close, invitations would fail to arrive. The cut was a signal to the whole of society that this person had fallen out of favour, and society, ever eager to follow the lead of its arbiters, would adjust its treatment of them accordingly. One cold shoulder, correctly applied, could ripple outward into real and lasting consequences. You recognise this, of course, because the impulse never died. The pointed failure to acknowledge, the deliberate looking through of someone you have decided no longer counts, remains one of the cruelest and most bloodless weapons humans possess. The dandies simply perfected it, gave it grades and rules, and elevated the snub into a fine art. But the cut was a weapon of silence, and the dandy was equally deadly with sound. When he did choose to speak, his words could cut just as deep. If clothing was the dandy's armour, wit was his blade, and he kept it razor sharp. In these gilded rooms, a man's tongue could carry him further than his fortune, and the most celebrated dandies were feared not for their fists, but for their remarks, delivered cool and casual and utterly devastating. A perfectly timed insult dressed up as a polite observation could reduce a rival to rubble, while the whole room pretended to admire the wallpaper. Wit in this world was not mere entertainment. It was a survival skill, a form of combat, and a ladder to the top. A man of modest birth and empty pockets could not fight his way into the fashionable elite with money or bloodlines because he had neither. But a devastating tongue was available to anyone clever enough to wield it, and a reputation for wit could open doors that gold could not. The right remark, delivered at the right moment, could make you the most talked about man in London by morning, and being talked about in a society that ran on gossip was a currency more valuable than coin. The craft of it lay in the delivery. A crude insult shouted in anger was worthless, the mark of a man who had lost control. The true art was to wound with elegance, to deliver the killing line so casually, so lightly, wrapped so neatly in the form of a polite remark that it seemed to fall from your lips almost by accident. You never appeared to be trying. You never seemed cruel. You simply made an observation, cool and offhand, that happened to leave your target in ruins while you gazed serenely off in another direction. The apparent effortlessness was everything. A joke that looked laboured was a joke that had failed. And the whole room was your stage. An insult delivered in private is merely a disagreement. An insult delivered before an audience of the fashionable is a public execution, witnessed, relished, and repeated. The best lines did not die in the room where they were spoken. They travelled, carried from club to drawing room to dinner table, growing more polished with each retelling, until the whole of society had heard how so-and-so had been demolished by a single perfect sentence. A man could build an entire reputation on a handful of remarks that refused to be forgotten. But here is the danger, the sharp edge that cut both ways. The same wit that lifted you could destroy you, because a tongue that's sharp made enemies, and not all enemies were safe to make. Mocking a nobody cost you nothing. The nobody had no power to strike back. But the fashionable world was a web of the powerful, and somewhere in that web sat people who could end you, people whose vanity you wounded at your peril. A remark that seemed gloriously daring in the moment could curdle into a fatal mistake once the wrong person decided they had been humiliated one time too many. This is the tightrope every witty dandy walked, whether he admitted it or not. His genius was also his greatest liability. The applause that greeted his sharpest lines encouraged him to go further, to aim higher, to risk more, and the higher he aimed, the greater the fall if he misjudged his target. Live by the joke, and you may very well die by it, undone by a single line spoken to a man who was not willing to laugh. The most famous dandy of them all would learn this lesson in the most spectacular way imaginable. Aiming a joke at the one man in England it was truly dangerous to mock, but that reckoning is still ahead of us. For now there were softer battlefields to conquer, none more exclusive or more absurd than a certain set of assembly rooms where the cake was terrible and the door was guarded like a fortress. Let's talk about the single most exclusive room in all of England, a place so selective that being admitted was considered one of society's highest honours, the assembly rooms at Almack's. On the surface it sounds harmless, a venue for dances, weak tea and stale cake so unimpressive it became a running joke. The refreshments were famously dreadful, and yet men and women of the highest rank schemed, begged and grovelled for the privilege of walking through those doors on a Wednesday night. Let us begin with the sheer, glorious absurdity of the refreshments, because it tells you everything. The food and drink on offer were, by all accounts, miserable. Thin bread and butter, dry cake, weak tea and lemonade, the sort of spread that would embarrass a modest household, let alone the most coveted room in the kingdom. There was no feast, no flowing wine, no indulgence of any kind, and none of it mattered in the slightest, because nobody came to Almack's to eat. They came to be admitted, and admission was the entire point. This is the key to understanding the place. Almack's sold nothing but exclusivity itself, in its purest, most concentrated form. The value was not in what happened inside. The dancing was pleasant enough, the company was fine, but none of it justified the frantic scheming to get in. The value was entirely in the getting in the fact that so many were kept out. To pass through those doors was to be certified as belonging to the very highest tier of society. To be refused was to be told, publicly and unmistakably, that you did not. and so the powerful humbled themselves for a chance at it. Rich men, titled men accustomed to getting whatever they wished, found themselves in the strange position of having to beg, to angle, to court favour, all for the sake of a Wednesday evening of bad cake in an exclusive room. Wealth alone could not buy your way in. Rank alone could not force the door. You had to be granted admission, and the granting was in the hands of a small and merciless authority we shall meet shortly. The dress code was sacred, enforced with a rigidity that bordered on the comic. Gentlemen were required to appear in strict formal attire, knee breeches and a white cravat, with no room whatsoever for personal interpretation or fashionable rebellion. This was one of those last strongholds where the old order of breeches held absolute sway, and the newfangled trousers we discussed earlier were simply forbidden. It did not matter how modern or magnificent you were. The rule was the rule, and the rule was breeches. To prove just how absolute this was, consider the most famous casualty of the door. The story, cherished ever since, holds that even the great military hero of the age, the man who had defeated the terror of Europe on the battlefield, was once turned away from Almack's for the crime of being incorrectly dressed. If the conqueror of Napoleon himself could be refused entry over a matter of legwear, then no one at all was safe. The rule bowed to no rank, no reputation, no glory. It bowed only to itself. Pause on the wonder of that. A society that revered its heroes, that showered its victorious general with honours and adoration, would still shut the door in his face if he arrived in the wrong trousers. It is a perfect little monument to the priorities of the fashionable world, where the correct cravat outranked the salvation of a continent, at least on a Wednesday night. But who held this terrifying power over the door? The power to humble heroes and reject the merely rich? Not the men in the bow window, not the arbiters of the clubs, a small circle of formidable women, and their word was final. So who held the keys to this glittering cake-deficient paradise? Not kings, not dukes, a small committee of aristocratic women known as the patronesses, and they ruled the social season with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. Admission to Almack's required a voucher, and only these ladies could grant one, which meant that a handful of powerful women effectively decided who was in and who was cast into outer darkness. Picture the arrangement, because it is genuinely remarkable. In a world where men held nearly all the formal power, where women could not vote, could not sit in Parliament, could rarely control their own property once married, a tiny circle of great ladies had somehow carved out a kingdom entirely their own. Within the walls of the most exclusive rooms in London, their authority was absolute, and the grandest men in the country had no choice but to submit to it. It was one of the few arenas in the entire society where women reigned without question, and they did not reign gently. The voucher was the instrument of their power, a small ticket that meant everything. Without one, you did not enter, no matter who you were, and these vouchers were not for sale, could not be demanded, could not be won by any amount of wealth or rank. They were granted personally at the pleasure of the patronesses to those they deemed worthy, and withheld personally from those they did not. Every voucher was a judgment made flesh, a statement that this person belonged and that one did not, and the ladies dispensed them with the care and occasional cruelty of monarchs handing out titles. To secure a voucher, you courted the patronesses, and courting them was a delicate and often humiliating art. You had to be pleasing without being presumptuous, present without being pushy, charming without ever seeming to try too hard for something you were supposed to be above wanting. A wrong word, a poorly judged remark, a hint of arrogance, any of these could cost you, and once you had displeased one of these women, mercy was in short supply. They had long memories and no obligation whatsoever to explain themselves. The power they wielded reached far beyond the door of a single assembly room. To be admitted to Almack's was to be publicly stamped as belonging to the elite, and that stamp shaped everything. The invitations you received, the marriages you might make, the doors that opened or stayed shut across the whole of fashionable London. By controlling admission, the patronesses effectively controlled the borders of high society itself, deciding who was allowed to cross into the charmed inner circle and who was left forever pressing their face against the glass. And here is the detail that should make every strutting dandy pause. For all his power in the clubs, for all his devastating cuts and celebrated wit, even the mightiest arbiter of male fashion had to mind his manners around these women. He might rule the bow window, might make dukes anxious about their cravats, might reduce rivals to rubble with a single line, but he could not grant himself a voucher, and he could not force the patronesses to like him. In their kingdom, he was a supplicant like everyone else, and if he crossed them, they could quietly shut him out of the very society he supposedly commanded. It is a bracing reminder tucked inside all this male vanity and preening. The men strutted and posed and imagined themselves the masters of the fashionable world, but a determined circle of clever women held a set of keys the men could never take, and they guarded those keys with a formidable will. Now, with the door successfully behind you, let us follow the fashionable crowd to the tables where far greater fortunes than a voucher were won and lost. Now we come to the great destroyer, the beautiful monster lurking at the heart of dandy life, gambling. Behind the exclusive doors of the fashionable clubs, fortunes were won, and far more often obliterated across green baize tables in a single feverish night. Card games and games of chance with names now half forgotten drew crowds of glassy-eyed gentlemen who wagered sums that could have bought entire estates, all on the turn of a card or the roll of the dice. Gambling was woven so deeply into fashionable life that it was practically a duty. This was how gentlemen of leisure filled their endless nights, and the stakes were not the modest amounts of men playing for amusement. These were staggering sums, wagered casually, as though the money were nothing, which for a certain kind of dandy was precisely the pose to strike. To bet enormous amounts with an air of cool indifference was to demonstrate that you were so grand, so far above mere commerce, that a fortune more or less simply did not trouble you. The trouble, of course, was that for most of them it very much did. The games themselves were engines of ruin. Some turned entirely on chance, on the fall of dice, or the flip of a card, with no skill to shelter behind and no strategy to slow the bleeding. A man could sit down whole and rise a few hours later destroyed, his inheritance transferred across the table by nothing more than luck. One fashionable club became so notorious for its ruinous high-stakes play that it effectively gambled itself into oblivion, its members losing so relentlessly and so spectacularly that the whole establishment eventually collapsed under the weight of it. An entire institution, undone by the very appetite it existed to feed. The dandy code made the whole thing far more dangerous by forbidding any show of distress. You could lose everything, but you could not, must not, appear to care. To wince, to sweat, to betray the slightest anguish as your fortune vanished was hopelessly vulgar, the mark of a man who was not truly a gentleman. So they lost with smiles. They joked as they signed away their futures, made light of catastrophe, and rose from the table with a shrug and a witty remark while the ground gave way beneath their feet. The composure was admired. The composure was also a kind of madness, and there was a cruel double standard buried in the debts. A debt incurred at the gaming table was considered a debt of honour, sacred, binding, to be paid promptly and without question, because to welsh on a gambling debt was to disgrace yourself utterly among your peers. Yet the debt owed to the honest tailor The bootmaker, the wine merchant, the tradesman who had actually provided real goods and real labour could be left unpaid for years without any comparable shame. A gentleman would ruin himself to settle a card debt to a fellow dandy while cheerfully stiffing the craftsman who made his coat. The logic is baffling until you realise it was never about fairness. It was about status, and only the opinions of one's own kind counted. This appetite for the tables was the worm at the core of the whole glittering apple. The dandy world ran on the appearance of limitless wealth, but appearance is not the same as substance. And the gaming table was where the difference finally caught up with a man. Fortunes that had taken generations to build could be scattered in an evening, and no amount of perfect tailoring could stitch them back together. But we are getting ahead of ourselves toward the reckoning. There were still pleasures to enjoy, small rituals to perform, and one of the most fashionable involved a pinch of brown powder and a very expensive little box. In between the dressing, the strolling, and the ruinous gambling, a dandy needed something graceful to do with his hands, and the answer was snuff. Snuff was powdered tobacco, sniffed up the nose, and taking it was less about the substance and more about the ceremony. A true connoisseur owned a collection of exquisite little boxes, jewelled, enamelled, and absurdly expensive, and the ritual of producing one, flicking it open with a single practised thumb. Taking a pinch and inhaling with perfect poise was a performance in itself. The habit itself was simple enough. You took a small quantity of finely ground tobacco, placed it at the back of the hand or held it in a pinch between the fingers, and inhaled it sharply up the nose. The effect was a hit of the tobacco, a bracing little jolt, usually followed by a certain amount of sniffing, and, if you overdid it, a spectacular and undignified sneeze. But the pharmacology was almost beside the point. What mattered was how you did it, the grace and style you brought to the whole affair, because snuff-taking was a stage on which a fashionable man could perform his refinements several times a day. The box was the true glory of it. A serious devotee owned not one but many, a whole collection of snuff boxes, each a small masterpiece of the jeweller's or enameller's art, worked in gold and precious materials, painted with tiny scenes, studded and decorated and worth small fortunes. A man might have a different box for different occasions, different moods, and displaying the right one at the right moment was a way of quietly announcing your taste and wealth. These were not mere containers. They were jewels you carried and flourished, tiny portable declarations of your standing. And the ritual of using them was choreographed to a fine art. The truly accomplished could produce a box, open it, and take a pinch all with a single hand, flicking the lid with the thumb in one smooth, practised motion that separated the genuine adept from the fumbling beginner. It sounds like a small thing, this one-handed flourish, but in a world where every gesture was scrutinized, mastering it marked you as a man of true polish. There was an entire silent language in how you handled your snuff, and the fluent speakers of it wanted everyone to know they were fluent. Connoisseurs took the whole business with tremendous seriousness. Debating blends the way others debated fine wine, keeping different varieties for different times, discussing the merits of this mixture or that with the gravity of experts. A gentleman might pride himself on the quality and rarity of his snuff, on having access to blends others could not obtain, and to offer someone a pinch from your own box was a small social gesture, a courtesy that could flatter or, if withheld from the wrong person, subtly snub. Was any of this good for you? Not remotely. The habit left you sniffing and occasionally sneezing at inopportune moments, could stain the fingers and the fabulously expensive linen you worked so hard to keep pristine, and filled your fashionable rooms with a faint haze of brown dust that settled on everything. It was, in the plainest terms, a messy, unhealthy, pointless indulgence dressed up in gold and ceremony. But that description could apply to a great deal of dandy life, and it never stopped anyone. What snuff really offered was an occupation for idle hands and a chance to perform, and the dandy was always performing. It gave him a prop, a ritual, a reason to produce something beautiful and handle it beautifully in front of an audience. And when he tired of standing about looking refined, there were more vigorous ways to prove his quality, ways that let a gentleman work up an elegant sweat. Believe it or not, being a dandy was not entirely about lounging, sneering, and quietly going bankrupt. A fashionable gentleman was also expected to be sporting, or at least to look the part. So off you go to the boxing saloon of a famous former champion, where lords and dandies pulled on padded gloves and learned the manly science of pugilism from a genuine prize fighter, mostly so they could talk about it afterward. The boxing saloon was a fashionable institution in its own right, presided over by a celebrated former champion who had traded the brutal reality of the prize ring for the far more comfortable business of teaching gentlemen to throw a punch. Here, in a respectable establishment, the sons of the aristocracy and the leading men of fashion would strip down to their shirt sleeves, pull on padded gloves, and spar under expert guidance. It was called the manly art, the noble science, and it lent a fashionable gentleman a welcome air of vigour and toughness, a suggestion that beneath the perfect tailoring lay a man who could handle himself. Whether they actually could handle themselves was another question entirely. For most, the boxing was a genteel imitation of the real thing, a controlled and padded version conducted among equals in comfortable surroundings, a world away from the bloody bare-knuckle contests of the actual prize ring. But it hardly mattered. The point was to have trained with the famous champion, to be able to mention it, to carry the faint glamour of the fighting world into the drawing room. A gentleman who could say he sparred at the great man's saloon had acquired a valuable little piece of reputation, whether or not he could land a decent blow. Fencing offered a similar arrangement with a longer, sharper history. At the academies of the fashionable fencing masters, gentlemen learned the elegant footwork and precise blade work of the sword, an art that carried centuries of aristocratic prestige. It was graceful, disciplined, and demanding, and it made a man look wonderful, all poised limbs and controlled movement, which was at least half the reason to do it. Learning to fence was a way of claiming a piece of the old warrior nobility, of suggesting that one was not merely decorative but genuinely capable, a man of action in a beautifully cut shirt. There was, beneath all the posing, a genuinely practical edge to these pursuits, and it was not a comfortable one. This was still a world in which insults could not always be laughed off, in which matters of honour between gentlemen might end not with a witty remark but with a formal, deadly confrontation. Duels, though increasingly frowned upon, still happened, and a man who had offended the wrong person might find himself facing pistols or blades at dawn. In that grim light, knowing how to handle a sword or take a punch was not merely fashionable affectation, it was a form of insurance, a hedge against the day when wit alone would not save you. So the dandy sweated decorously in the best establishments, learning to fight in ways he mostly hoped never to use. It fit the whole pattern of his life, this blend of genuine skill and pure performance, of real training put mostly to the service of reputation. He wanted to be seen as capable, dangerous even, while spending his days in about the safest and most comfortable version of danger that money could arrange. And when he wished to combine his fashionable vigour with genuine neck-breaking peril, there was one pursuit that offered speed, spectacle, and a very real chance of catastrophe, all in front of the largest possible audience. For a dandy who wished to combine fashion with the very real risk of death, there was nothing finer than driving. The height of sporting style was to handle a light, fast carriage pulled by beautifully matched horses, ideally at a pace that terrified pedestrians and delighted onlookers. There were even fashionable clubs devoted to gentlemen who prided themselves on driving teams of 4 horses, dressing the part in coachman-inspired outfits, and thundering along in a display of reckless, moneyed confidence. Understand first what a status symbol the right carriage was. A light, fast, elegant vehicle, drawn by horses whose colour and stride were matched with obsessive care, was among the most conspicuous displays of wealth and taste a man could make. It was expensive to buy, expensive to maintain, and expensive to stock with the finest animals, and it announced all of that expense to everyone who saw it flash past. To drive your own smart carriage reins in hand was to broadcast that you were rich, sporting, and daringly modern, a man who did his own driving for the sheer style of it, rather than sitting meekly behind a hired coachman. The truly devoted took it further, forming fashionable clubs built around the demanding skill of driving a team of 4 horses at once, a feat that required genuine ability and no small amount of nerve. These gentlemen would deck themselves out in elaborate outfits inspired by professional coachmen, adopting the dress of the working drivers as a kind of fashionable costume, and then set off in company to show off their skill and their turnouts. There was something delightfully absurd in wealthy men playing at being coachmen, dressing up as the very labourers they would never dream of actually being, all in pursuit of sporting glamour. The grand stage for all this display was the park, where at the fashionable hour of the afternoon the beautiful people gathered to ride and drive along a celebrated stretch of ground. This was the promenade all over again, only faster and grander and far more dangerous. Here the fashionable set paraded on horseback and in their finest carriages, seeing and being seen, the whole glittering competition of the streets transferred to a setting of open ground and thundering hooves. To move through that crowd in a fine turnout, handling your team with cool skill, was to be at the very centre of the fashionable world. But speed and spectacle came with genuine peril, and that was rather the point. A light carriage driven fast by an amateur was an accident waiting to happen, and accidents happened. Horses bolted, wheels caught, vehicles overturned, spilling their fashionable drivers onto the ground before the largest and most judgmental audience in London. To crash was a humiliation of the first order, a public unmasking of a man who had claimed skill he did not possess. But to drive perfectly, to handle your team with careless mastery while others gawked, was to be admired as a true sporting gentleman, and the risk of the first outcome was exactly what made the second so glorious. It captures the whole dandy spirit rather neatly, this business of driving. Enormous expense, real danger, genuine skill, and pure performance, all braided together in a pursuit whose true purpose was to be watched and envied. He risked his neck for style, spent fortunes on horses and carriages he could scarcely afford, and did it all with the studied indifference that was the mark of his kind. Yet even as he thundered through the park looking magnificent, the dandy was fighting a quieter, more personal battle, one waged not against rival drivers, but against his own body and its stubborn refusal to stay fashionably thin. That flawless sculpted silhouette we admired earlier came at a price, and part of that price was food, or rather, the tragic lack of it. To fit into clothes cut this close, a fashionable man had to stay slim, and so began some of history's more miserable diets. The great trendsetter of the age was known for eating remarkably little, picking at vegetables and treating a hearty meal as something close to a moral failing. The problem was structural, quite literally. Everything about the dandy's dress demanded a lean, tapering figure, the narrow waist, the close-cut coat, the clinging pantaloons that hid nothing. There was no room in that silhouette for the comfortable softness that comes so easily to a man who dines and drinks well every night. And dine and drink well they most certainly did. The fashionable life was one long procession of rich dinners, flowing wine and late suppers, all of which conspired against the very slimness the fashion required. Something had to give, and often what gave was the pleasure of eating. The leading arbiter of taste set the tone here as he did everywhere, reportedly eating with an almost aggressive restraint, favouring modest portions of plain things and regarding overindulgence at the table as beneath a truly elegant man. To pick delicately, to seem indifferent to food, to treat the appetite as something to be mastered rather than obeyed, this was the fashionable posture. A gentleman of real refinement did not fall upon his dinner like a hungry labourer. He trifled with it, as though eating were a mildly tiresome necessity that he could take or leave. Others took the pursuit of slimness to genuinely alarming extremes, and here the fashionable diet crossed into something closer to self-torture. One celebrated figure of the era, a man of great fame and great terror at the prospect of growing stout, subjected himself to punishing regimes designed to keep the flesh off at any cost. He would live for stretches on the most meagre and joyless fare imaginable, sustaining himself on thin biscuits and soda water, or on potatoes soaked in vinegar, and other grim experiments in eating as little actual nourishment as a body could endure. It was starvation dressed up as discipline, and it took a real toll. The goal of all this suffering was a particular look, and it was not the look of robust health. The fashionable ideal was pale, lean, and faintly interesting, the appearance of a man too refined and too preoccupied with higher things to bother much with food. A certain delicacy, even a hint of fragility, was admired, the suggestion of a sensitive soul who lived on air and elegance rather than mutton and pudding. Ruddy good health looked coarse, pale slenderness looked poetic, and so men starved themselves toward an aesthetic that prized the very look that hunger produces. There is something painfully familiar in all of this, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The idea that one must suffer, must deny the body, must wage constant war on one's own appetite in pursuit of a fashionable shape, did not begin or end with the dandies. They simply pursued it with the same obsessive intensity they brought to everything else, chasing thinness with vinegar and soda water and grim willpower, and calling the misery elegance, so as your stomach growls its complaint in the middle of a dazzling evening. Take some cold comfort that you suffer in the finest company. Hunger was the fashion, and a lean and tortured beauty was worth, in the dandy's reckoning, the price of a rumbling stomach. But no account of the dandy's rise and fall can avoid the one relationship that lifted him highest and then destroyed him most completely, his friendship with the most powerful man in the land. No account of the dandy's world is complete without the most powerful man in it, the Prince Regent, the future king, nicknamed Prinny by the fashionable set. For a glorious stretch, the reigning arbiter of taste and the royal heir were the closest of companions, a partnership that lifted the humble dandy to dizzying heights, because if the prince laughed at your jokes and copied your coats, all of society fell into line behind him. Consider what this friendship meant for a man of no great birth. The prince was the heir to the throne, the very centre of the fashionable universe, the person around whom all of high society revolved. To be his intimate, his companion, the man whose taste he admired and whose company he sought, was to be handed a golden key to everything. The arbiter of style, a man risen on nerve and cravats rather than ancient blood, found himself walking beside royalty, and the whole of society took careful note. If the future king treated this man as an equal, as a friend, as an authority on matters of taste, then who could possibly question his standing? The partnership suited both men, at least for a time. The prince, himself devoted to fashion, extravagance and pleasure, delighted in the wit and impeccable style of his companion, and the association burnished the dandy's authority to a blinding shine. Together they set the tone for fashionable London, the prince lending royal weight and the dandy lending taste and cutting brilliance. It was, for a season, a mutually flattering arrangement, and the dandy rode it to the very summit of the social world. But friendships built on flattery and shared vanity are brittle things, and this one carried the seeds of its own destruction. The prince was proud and increasingly sensitive, particularly about his expanding figure, which the fashionable life had not been kind to. The dandy, meanwhile, grew ever bolder, ever more secure in his own supremacy, and ever more inclined to let his famous tongue run where it pleased. A man who has made a career of devastating remarks does not always know when to hold one back, and the temptation to be witty at the expense of even the grandest target could prove too strong to resist. And so the friendship curdled, cooling into distance and then into open hostility. The details of the falling out matter less than the spectacular manner in which the dandy chose to acknowledge it. At a crowded, fashionable gathering, finding himself deliberately snubbed by the prince, who pointedly greeted his companion while ignoring the dandy entirely, the dandy refused to absorb the insult in silence. Instead, in a moment of breathtaking suicidal audacity, he turned to his friend and asked, loudly enough for all to hear, and with the prince standing right there, who exactly his fat friend might be. It was the funniest line of his life, and very nearly the last funny thing his position would ever allow him. In that single sentence he had done the unthinkable, mocked the future king to his face, in public, about his weight, before an audience of the very people whose opinion made and unmade reputations. The wit that had carried him to the top had just aimed itself at the one target no amount of cleverness could survive. A joke about a rival cost nothing. A joke about the heir to the throne, delivered to his face, was a fatal miscalculation dressed up as a triumph. The room may have laughed, or gasped, or both, but the powerful do not forget, and a future king wields a very long memory in a very heavy hand. The dandy had lit the fuse on his own destruction, and the explosion, when it came, would be measured not in laughter, but in ruin, exile, and a fall as complete as his rise had been dazzling. We have laughed about the unpaid tailor and the gambling losses, but now the bill comes due, in every sense. The entire dandy lifestyle was a magnificent structure built on borrowed money and borrowed time. The clothes, the boots, the rooms, the horses, the snuff boxes, the wine, all of it flowed in on credit extended by tradesmen, who assumed a fashionable gentleman was good for it. And for a while, the illusion held. It is worth tallying just once the sheer cost of being a dandy, because the numbers were ruinous even for men of real fortune. Every element of the life we have described carried a price, and often a staggering one. The tailoring alone could consume a fortune, and the dandy did not order one coat but many, replaced as fashion shifted or as a garment lost its perfect freshness. Add the boots, the endless changes of linen, the pairs of gloves discarded at the first smudge, the fine wine, the jewelled snuff boxes, the horses and carriages, the rooms in the right address, and the gambling losses on top of it all, and you have a torrent of expense with no corresponding income, for the true dandy did not work. This is the fatal flaw at the heart of the whole enterprise. The dandy's brand was leisure, his entire identity built on the pose that he did not toil, did not earn, did not sully himself with anything so common as a livelihood, but money that does not come in must eventually run out, and a man who spends lavishly while earning nothing is simply drawing down a reservoir that has no source. For those who began with a fortune, the reservoir might last for years, giving the illusion of endless wealth. But it drained all the same, quietly, steadily, while the spending never slowed. The whole system was propped up by credit, by the willingness of tradesmen to supply goods now against the promise of payment later. and that willingness, as we saw with the tailors, rested on reputation and hope more than on any solid guarantee. A fashionable gentleman was assumed to be good for his bills, and so the coats and boots and wine kept coming, the debts mounting in ledgers all over London while the dandy floated along above them, serenely refusing to think about anything so vulgar as what he owed. But creditors are patient, not saintly, and the polite fiction could not last forever. As the bills went unpaid and the sums grew monstrous, the tradesmen's patience curdled into something harder. The creditors, politely known as duns, began to press, and their pressing grew less polite with every passing season. A man might find himself dodging his own bootmaker in the street, avoiding certain shops, growing skilled at the undignified art of not being where his creditors expected him to be. The magnificent, serene dandy, reduced to a fugitive from the men who addressed him, and behind the mounting debts loomed a genuinely terrifying prospect. For this was an age with a merciless remedy for men who could not pay. A debtor might be seized and imprisoned, locked away, and held until his debts were somehow settled, a fate that could trap a man indefinitely, since it is remarkably difficult to earn one's way out of anything from inside a cell. This shadow fell across even the grandest figures of fashion, the knowledge that beneath all the glory one determined creditor and one unpaid bill could bring the whole shining edifice crashing into a prison. The clock, in other words, was always ticking, and for the man who had mocked a prince and gambled away a fortune, it was ticking very loudly indeed. When the debts finally overwhelmed him and the powerful enemies gathered, there would be only one road left open, and it led out of England entirely. And here is where the fairy tale collapses. For all his wit, all his taste, all his mastery over dukes and princes, the dandy could not outsneer his debts forever. When the gambling losses piled too high and the creditors closed in, there was often only one exit left, and it was not a graceful one. Under cover of quiet, the most legendary dandy of them all simply fled the country, slipping across the Channel to France to escape the debtor's prison waiting for him at home. Let us sit with the completeness of the collapse, because it is genuinely staggering. Here was the man who had ruled fashionable London, who had made and unmade reputations from a club window, who had dictated the tilt of every hat and the fold of every cravat, who had counted the future king among his friends and dared to mock him to his face. He had stood at the absolute summit of the social world, feared and admired and copied by the greatest men in the land, and now that same man was creeping out of the country in the dark, running from tradesmen's bills like any common debtor, because that, stripped of all the glamour, was exactly what he had become. The flight itself was a shabby, undignified affair, the opposite of everything the dandy had projected. There was no grand departure, no farewell to admiring crowds, only a quiet slipping away to avoid the creditors and the prison that awaited a man who could not pay. He crossed the water to France, to the port towns and cheaper lodgings where an Englishman fleeing his debts might live beyond the reach of those he owed. The Channel became his moat, not to keep enemies out, but to keep himself from being dragged back to answer for his ruin, and he was far from alone in taking that road. The continent became a refuge for a whole class of fashionable Englishmen who had spent themselves into disaster, gentlemen who had lived too well and paid too little, and finally run out of both money and excuses. They traded the ballrooms and clubs of London for foreign towns and dwindling funds, exiles from the very society they had once adorned, living out their days in a reduced and faded version of the splendour they had known. The glittering life had a great many such casualties, men who shone brilliantly and then vanished across the water into obscurity. What makes the story so sharp is the sheer distance between the image and the reality. On the surface, the dandy was the embodiment of wealth, taste, and effortless superiority, a man who seemed to float above all common care. Beneath that surface lay unpaid bills, mounting terror, and finally flight. The channel that he crossed in the dark measured, better than anything, the gap between what the dandy appeared to be and what he actually was, the space between the dazzling public performance and the desperate private truth. For the greatest of them, exile was not a temporary setback, but the beginning of a long, slow ending. The man who had crossed the water to escape his debts would not come sweeping triumphantly home. He would remain abroad, his fortune gone, his glory fading into memory, watched from a distance as the society he had once commanded moved on without him. The performance was over, and no wit, no cravat, no perfect coat could summon back the world he had lost. And so we arrive at the last act, the quiet and rather sad conclusion of a life lived so brilliantly on the surface, and at the surprising enduring legacy these ruined men left behind them. So how does the story end? Not well, for most of them. The greatest dandy of the age, once the friend of a king and the terror of high society, died far from London, penniless and broken, his mind gone, his fortune long since gambled and borrowed into nothing. It is a grim finale for a man who had lived so brilliantly on the surface of things. Trace the shape of that fall, and it is almost unbearable in its completeness. The man who had stood at the very centre of the fashionable world, whose approval the powerful had begged for, whose remarks had travelled across the whole of society, ended his days in exile, poor, forgotten by the glittering crowd that had once hung on his every word. The wit dimmed, the health failed, and in the end even the sharp and celebrated mind that had made him famous slipped away from him. He who had lived for admiration died with almost no one watching, in circumstances as mean as his heyday had been magnificent. The distance between the beginning and the end of his story is the whole moral of it, and he was not alone in his ruin. This was, in the end, the common fate of the breed. The gambling, the borrowing, the relentless spending in pursuit of an image that produced no income, all of it led, for man after man, to the same grim destinations: debt, exile, disgrace, and sometimes a lonely and diminished death far from the scenes of their triumphs. They had burned brilliantly and briefly, and burning brilliantly is a very expensive way to live. The fashionable world moved on, as it always does, and the men who had ruled it faded into cautionary tales. And yet, here is the strange, quiet triumph buried in all that wreckage, the thing that redeems the whole absurd, ruinous enterprise. The dandies lost their money, their friends, and often their minds, but they won something they could never have imagined and never lived to fully see. They changed permanently the way men dress, and in doing so they reached out of their own doomed era and shaped everyone that followed. Remember the great revolution of the coat, the rejection of gaudy excess in favour of dark, sober, perfectly cut restraint. Remember the obsession with fit over-decoration, with immaculate cleanliness, with the idea that true elegance lies in quiet perfection rather than loud display. These were not passing fashions that died with the men who invented them. They became the very foundation of modern menswear, the principles underlying the tailored suit, the crisp white shirt, the whole notion that a well-cut garment in a quiet colour is the height of a certain kind of style. Every man who has ever felt the quiet confidence of a suit that fits him perfectly owes a small, unknowing debt to these vain and ruined creatures. The instinct they pioneered runs even deeper than clothing. That whole idea, so familiar to us now that we forget it had to be invented, that real elegance whispers while cheap taste shouts, that the most confident presence in a room is often the simplest, that restraint can be more powerful than display. All of this traces back to these men and their competitive contempt for the peacocks who came before them. They taught the world a lesson in style that the world never unlearned. So there is something almost poetic in the final reckoning. They bankrupted themselves, chasing an impossible perfection, ruined their lives in pursuit of being admired, and paid for their vanity with everything they had. But in the wreckage of all those wasted fortunes, they accidentally dressed the future, and the future has worn their idea ever since, never quite knowing whom to thank. So there you have it. A single day in the life of a Regency dandy, and what a beautifully exhausting day it was. You woke in rented rooms you couldn't afford and spent hours becoming presentable, scrubbed and shaved and plucked, laced into whalebone until the room went swimmy, wrestled into a coat you couldn't quite bend in, and did battle with a strip of starched cloth that left a snowdrift of failures on your floor. You strolled so the city could admire you. You ruled from a window and destroyed rivals with a single turned shoulder. You starved yourself elegantly, gambled away fortunes with a smile, polished your boots with champagne while dodging the men who made them, and mocked a future king to his face. And for all of it, for all that dazzling, ruinous effort, most of these men ended in debt, in exile, in quiet obscurity far from the rooms they once commanded. But there's something oddly moving in how hard they tried. They chased perfection until it bankrupted them, and in the wreckage, almost by accident, they taught the world that true elegance whispers. Every well-cut coat worn since carries a faint echo of their vanity and their genius. So tonight, as you settle into a bed you can actually afford, in clothes you can breathe in, with a full stomach and no creditors at the door, maybe spare a gentle thought for those beautiful, doomed men. They suffered magnificently so they could be admired, and somehow they still found the whole thing worth doing. Because history is often vain and reckless and just a little ridiculous, but it's also proof that people will endure almost anything for a moment in the light. Rest easy now. You have nothing to prove and nowhere to be. Good night.